So welcome everyone. This is our second seminar in the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative seminar series. Last week we met with David Kilcullen and had a wonderful discussion about his vision of the future, and admittedly he didn't have a lot of religion in it, but the audience genuinely pulled him back into that. Today we have an amazing panel. Jessica Stern, Mark Juergensmeyer, Martha Crenshaw, and Scott Appleby. And this was only made possible by Roger Hertog, working with Matthew Connolly, who's a professor at Columbia University, who have come together and put together over a number of years programs on different aspects of global strategy. This is the third. The first year was nuclear proliferation. The second was pandemics and public health. And this year it's on religion, violence, and apocalyptic movements. I'm Monica Toft. I'm one of the co-conveners for this year, working in partnership with Matt. We have an amazing set of students. Today we had sort of a brainstorming session about different ideas with religious violence, peace, and of course terrorism, given the panel. So I've asked the panel, by the way, I'm at Harvard University, although I'll be leaving for the University of Oxford in the fall, and even having done a lot of research in this field, I'm sort of awed by this august community that we've brought here together and that I was able to spend the day with. I've asked each of them to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, just sort of addressing what they think are the pressing issues in their field of research. Some of them work on terrorism directly. Scott does more on peace and reconciliation and has written a fabulous book, The Ambivalence of the Sacred, and talking about how religion is can be a force for good, and also can be a force, of course, for evil or violence. And he talks about militants. I love that idea, militants for peace and militants for violence. We're going to start with Mark. We sort of came to that decision. And then we're going to go to Martha, then Jessica, and Scott, I think the guy on the peaceful end, is going to finish us off. And then we'll sort of probe some of their comments and then open it up to the audience. So Scott, you can stay there if you want, and we'll keep it pretty informal. Thank you.
Monica, you want me to come up there?
No, I think you can stay.
Oh, okay. Hi, everybody. Well, this is going to be an interesting discussion, in part because none of us knows what we're going to say. Jessica's eagerly hoping that I will say something kind of angular and difficult that she can respond vigorously to. We work off each other because we're an old crowd. The four of us on this panel seem always to turn up at similar events when they need terrorism experts, and it always turns out to our surprise to be us. I don't know how you feel about it, Martha or Jessica, but when you're on television occasionally and you see the scroll Martha Crenshaw, terrorism expert, well, you come by it, I think, more authentically. Not that you don't, Jessica, or I don't, but I'm always a bit surprised. I wasn't born to be a terrorism expert. My mother didn't raise me to be a terrorist. What went wrong somehow?
Because I was born.
You were born to be a terrorism expert. Well, I wasn't. And that really speaks to the question, because in a sense, there is no single such thing as terrorism as a field. It is a collection of different interests, of people who come at the subject from a lot of different academic perspectives, who are brought together usually because of the course of events. So to talk about the future of terrorist studies is to talk about the future of terrorism as a phenomenon. How does it impact our lives? How do we respond to it? How does it affect the scholarly world? And I can tell you, in my case, as I say, I wasn't born to be a terrorist expert on terrorism. I have a background in both religion and politics. The religion part came from Union Theological Seminary across the street. And while I was doing an div degree there, I was doing a degree in international affairs in this very building, in international studies, and then went off to get a PhD in political science with a lot of time in India along the way. So as somebody who's always been interested in the intersection of religion and politics, and particularly in the Indian context where all religion is political and all politics is religious, when the awful spiral of violence between young Sikh extremists and the Indian government develop into a cacophony of protest and violence in the 1980s, I wanted to know why. I wanted to try to make sense of it. And I think each of us has a different story, but is similar, that as scholars and as citizens, we simply want to know why. Why do moments seem to boil over into vicious acts of terrorism? There was a moment after the Madrid train attack in Spain when the Spanish government convened together the largest convocation of terrorist experts ever, before or since, I think. Almost 1,000 experts in terrorism from around the world. I was asked, Louise Richardson was helping to coordinate the whole project, a colleague of ours who was at Harvard, and now she's at the Vice Chancellor at St. Andrews. And she asked me to be in charge of the group on religious terrorism. And we were asked to discern what was the root of religious terrorism. It was in the singular. What was the root of religious terrorism? And we talked and we talked and we talked and we talked and talked, and after a week, we came up with a unanimous decision that there was a problem with the metaphor. That there was no root of religious terrorism, because this implies a tree, this implies a kind of organic thing that has a root, and if you can find that root, that cause, that central cause, and you can exterminate it, you get rid of the whole damn problem, which is a wonderful image and a wonderful idea, but we decided we would offer a different metaphor. And the metaphor we offered was the metaphor of the forest fire. And the question is, what causes forest fires? Is it the existence of incendiary material? You know, a lot of brush and trees. Is it the weather, the dry conditions and the winds that cause a forest fire? Is it a little spark, a incendiary moment that ignites the whole thing? Is that what causes forest fire? Or is it, of course, all of those things, and sometimes never, because even if all these things happen, there still won't be a forest fire. There's a little bit of luck, or maybe bad luck, that's involved in the same way. So we decided that terrorism is like that. It's a conjunction of components, each of which is important to study and understand on its own, but neither of what makes sense in isolation. Which is why we need each other, the four of us on this panel and our many other colleagues. We need to see the various lenses through which this phenomenon occurs. In my experience of the study of religious terrorism, I've defined terrorism as performance violence, as the creation of an act of violence for the purpose of intimidation, which can be done by a whole host of people, and states as well as individual actors. I think none of us who study the kind of extremism that's common in our time want to deny that states aren't even better at terrorism than individuals are, and sometimes there is a reciprocal relationship between these facts. And one of the annoying things is that governments all like to pretend like the terrorism of the people they don't like exists in a vacuum without states being, in many cases, provocateurs of helping to create the conditions in which people feel intimidated and feel like they need to respond in terrorist ways. So at this moment of history, when we've just gone through an exhausting decade of terrorism and terrorist studies, and an extraordinary expansion of the field of people who were involved from a lot of different perspectives in this singular phenomenon, it is sensible to ask what's going to happen next and how will the field of studies follow it. And I think this is the point at which Jessica and Martha will pick up, but I can only say that it is developing into the phenomenon is developing differently as specific movements like Al-Qaeda, who seem to thrive on nothing but the image of cosmic war, nothing but the image of grand confrontation, seem to be losing steam and losing followers. But the phenomenon will exist in other contexts and in other ways, and this means that the field is going to have to shift and move and change in order to make sense of it as the phenomenon itself moves and shifts and changes over history.
Thanks, Mark. And we have Martha from Stanford University, then Jessica, who's also at Stanford at the Hoover Institute, and then we're going to go to Scott, who's at Notre Dame. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Monica. Can you all hear me? Sounds like this is on. Unlike Mark, I have studied terrorism for most of my academic career. I stumbled into it by and large. I wrote my PhD dissertation on the use of terrorism by the FLN during the Algerian War. So you can see that this was some time ago. It was well before our idea of modern terrorism. However, just as a sort of reference a little bit to the past, there was definitely an Islamic dimension to the Algerian Revolution and a certain Islamic dimension to the use of terrorism by the FLN, although we really, at that point in time, many years ago, weren't really even thinking about the relationship so much between terrorism and violence. And interestingly enough, we still tend to bifurcate the political and the religious, because Mark was making a reference to the meetings in Madrid that at least the three of us attended. Scott, you may have been there as well. It was a very large gathering organized by the Club de Madrid to really try to get at the causes of terrorism. And my working group was the political causes of terrorism, as though that was something quite distinct from economic and religious and other types of causes of terrorism. So looking sort of both at the past and at the future in terms of the study of terrorism and the phenomenon of terrorism, now when we, or at least the popular imagination and most governments think of terrorism, we think of it as an Islamist phenomenon, as a Salafist phenomenon, as primarily an Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliated phenomenon. But of course this was not the case if we look at a longer historical span. And 9/11, when the attacks happened, appeared to confirm a view that had gained quite a lot of traction with academics and especially with policymakers and pundits. And that was that terrorism infused by religion was new, something fundamentally new, and that other forms of terrorism, particularly nationalist, secular terrorism, was old. In other words, we had moved from one era to a new era of terrorism. There was something fundamentally different. And this school of thought argued that the new terrorism was apocalyptic in its objectives, millenarian, that they simply wanted to destroy everything. For example, Steve Simon and Dan Benjamin. Dan Benjamin is now the coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department. They were both staffers in the Clinton administration, wrote a book called The Age of Sacred Terror. And they said, these groups, the new religious groups, they don't want to sit at the table, they want to destroy the table. You can't talk to them, you can't negotiate with them. Their goals are totally non-negotiable. They just want to basically to destroy. And they also argued as a corollary that the new terrorists were unlimited in their means just as they were unlimited in their ends. They just wanted to kill a lot of people. Well, frankly, if you're a group that just wants to kill people with no further purpose, you're really out of the realm of terrorism as a form of violence. But leave that aside for the moment. But these are groups that just wanted to kill large numbers of people, as many as possible. Mass casualties was their main aim. There was not much more than that. And they also argued that the new terrorism was different from the old because it was highly decentralized, flat organizationally, whereas in their view the old terrorists were very hierarchical, very centralized, very, very tightly organized and structured. And I argued that this was really not the case, that there was much more continuity between the old and the new. In fact, that this sort of bifurcation between old and new was sort of phony, and that it obscured a lot about what was really the same about this new supposed terrorism. If you trace the history of people talking about some form of terrorism being entirely new, it really goes back well before the emergence of Al-Qaeda on the scene, and you can really trace it back early on to actually to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was when people first began to be concerned about the relationship between religion and terrorism. And it's also very much traceable to the advent of suicide terrorism or suicide bombings. So part of the argument was that these are people who are willing to kill themselves in their bombs, How can you defeat such an enemy? And isn't this fundamentally irrational on the part of these new terrorists, whereas the old were much more concerned about their own lives, other people's lives? The new terrorists are not concerned whatsoever with this. But again, it dated back really the early discussions. But again, this is all cemented by 9/11. This appeared to confirm this set of beliefs. And this is relevant in a number of ways. One is because when the Bush administration began to respond to terrorism post 9/11, and as we all know, it came as an almost total surprise to the administration, although there had been lots of warnings. And in fact, although Richard Clarke, who was the so-called czar of counterterrorism under Clinton, made the transition to the Bush administration and tried to warn them over and over that something was coming. And as we know, the administration was late in taking office and also focused on a number of other things, such as what to do about Russia, what to do about immigration, great power politics. Terrorism just was not on the radar screen. So in many ways, I think the very, I don't want to say an overreaction to 9/11, but certainly an extremely vigorous reaction to 9/11, I think was due not just to 9/11, but the fact that it came as such an enormous surprise, and a surprise after they actually had been warned. So that's largely a surmise. So you remember that Bush began his first term really linking terrorism and 9/11 very much to Islam. He even referred to Islamofascism a time or two, and was called to account for using that particularly offensive type of term. By the second 4 years of the Bush administration, if you study the rhetoric, it had begun to shift, and there was much less of a focus on Islam somehow as a body of thought that would be the cause of terrorism. But this was still very much part of how we thought of the Bush administration. What's interesting is that when Obama came to power, they made a very deliberate shift away from talking about anything to do with Islam, and they began to talk about violent extremism, i.e. we're now back into the realm of secular violence as well as religious violence, and it's now violent extremism that we talk about. They were beginning to make that move, I will say to their credit, in the second term of the Bush administration. But it's a very interesting shift in rhetoric in a way to try to get away from this notion that somehow it's some variant of Islam, whatever we call it, Salafism or Islamism, that's at the root of terrorism. So there's an attempt to downplay this angle of terrorism. But what's interesting to me about this is that part of that discussion of the new terrorism back when it was sort of in its heyday, which is roughly parallels, the lot of talk about the new terrorism parallels the emergence of Al-Qaeda, sort of period 1998 on. There was an assumption on the part of many policymakers and many people writing about the subject, sort of two assumptions. One assumption is still very much with us, and that is that nuclear terrorism is a major national security threat. We actually haven't talked about this in our seminar, but the Bush administration and the Obama administrations, great continuity here, rate the prospect of nuclear terrorism, the acquisition or use of nuclear materials by non-state actors or irresponsible state actors who might give these materials to non-state actors, as a #1 threat. Now, there was some interest in this. Jessica has written about the use of different sorts of unconventional weapons by terrorist groups. But the notion generally would be that it wouldn't be just any group that would be willing to use such methods. It would require a group that actually fit the new terrorism mold, a group that had more apocalyptic ambitions. I'm not sure whether I agree with that or not, but it's something that's worth thinking about, because this is certainly a major concern of the administration, that one of these groups that we typically call terrorists. Now, generally, if such a group were going to acquire such weapons and use them, I have some thoughts as to how they might use them, but just a point to keep in mind as we're looking toward the future, because now we're obviously nuclear terrorism, with our great good fortune, has not happened. Will it happen in the future? If we indeed are thinking of Al-Qaeda and related Islamist or Salafist movements as becoming increasingly decentralized and flat, if this is our prediction that these organizations will become much more a loose group of wannabes, imitators, lookalikes, then they're not going to have the capacity to use these kinds of materials. So the threat of nuclear terrorism, I would say, would be receding. The motivation might be there, but the capability won't be there. On the other hand, if we think that Al-Qaeda is a very resilient organization that maybe has more popular backing than we think it does, if they reconstituted themselves in a more organized form, or if the various Al-Qaeda affiliates, such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, others, really became stronger than they are, then we might see actually a group that had the capacity to actually acquire and use these sorts of weapons. So that's just sort of a way of looking to the future and saying we need to be looking at how the threat as we see it now is going to morph as we move toward the future. And I also want to reinforce a point that Mark made in concluding, which is that we tend to focus on the threat of the moment, the threat du jour, and it might be one particular sort of thing, it might be another particular sort of thing. In the 1970s, it was left revolutionary movements that were emerging in Western democracies, including the United States, where we had the Weathermen, which was sort of a nascent terrorist organization that never fulfilled that kind of objective, but in Italy and Germany, that was what we all worried about, and that was all we saw. We didn't see anything else coming. So we might think of the fact that we're so absorbed now with the idea of Islamist, Al-Qaeda-oriented, Al-Qaeda-linked terrorism that we might not see something else emerging on the horizon. There are, of course, far-right groups that are still very much out there. We know that's very much with us. So I would just say in conclusion that we need to be open to the possibility that something that we don't even see now might emerge on the horizon and emerge very quickly.
Thank you, Martha. Jessica?
I think I'll pick up from Martha's last points. One of the themes that's come out in your questions to me, I guess to all of us, is what is the right lens, academic lens, for looking at these kind of questions? And what I've said, and I think it bears repeating, is that because this issue requires so many different disciplines, actually, it doesn't really matter. I think almost any disciplinary lens can be useful to you, provided you understand that you are going to have to teach yourself to a large extent. I do remember a conference, which may have been before or after Madrid, I'm not sure, where Ehud Spinzak was with us. And I was astonished that the senior terrorism experts were saying how it was such a bad idea to focus on terrorism if you wanted to get terrorism, a tenure, that it was the kiss of death, that there were a few people who managed to do it in the past, but certainly for my generation, forget it. It's not a discipline in of itself, and I think that for you, that will probably no longer be the case, but I'm not entirely sure of it, because terrorism does come and go, and we're obviously, it comes in waves, and it's not just that new groups emerge quickly that we, the one thing we can be sure of is that we won't be talking about Islamist terrorism 20 years from now. We don't know what it will be next, but we know it won't be, or I think we can be pretty sure it won't be an Al-Qaeda related group. I think there is this tendency when the threat is not visible, in the sense that risk analysts use that term, to ignore the threat. And I think it really was kind of a girl's topic. Martha and I were talking in the cab going back to our hotel about how she felt that although her topic of her dissertation was considered to be very, very weird, it was appropriate for a woman because she would be following her husband around anyway. And I know that when I wrote about terrorism in my dissertation, and even writing about chemical weapons, it was definitely a backwater topic. It wasn't, and really when 9/11 happened, there was this small group of people, some of whom have been working on it, since the 1940s, right? No. Really long time. I meant it to be a compliment. Suddenly I realized, wait a minute. But actually, there probably are people who have been working on it since then. It was the kind of people who got attracted to the topic were just people who were obsessed with this weird issue. It wasn't people who necessarily would be good at or want to go on TV described as a terrorism expert, whereas there's some other areas. I mean, I felt like it was okay, that I was alone, I had some colleagues, but it wasn't like an overpopulated field, and it's obviously quite different now. And then I would say that we overreacted in 9/11. Suddenly the threat became visible. There was literally a visible image of people jumping out of that building. And we reacted very strongly, emotionally. And I would say certainly going to war in Iraq was an overreaction. And the way we've handled the war in Afghanistan has not really been a rational response to the actual threat. In terms of the future of the discipline, to the extent there is one, I mentioned earlier that there are more data available. Yes, there are problems with the data, but boy, before 9/11, the State Department made data available that were only international incidents. And Martha, you pointed out earlier today that most terrorism is actually perpetrated by groups in the country where they're situated, so that we were missing a huge amount of the data. It was absurd to try to analyze those data. So that is a change, even though that one must be very, very careful any time using data collected by others. Nonetheless, it's massively better than it was. Terrorists are making their manifestos available widely. Those data are available. They didn't used to be available. I mean, this is really a wonderful, for researchers, there's just so much available. I think for all of you thinking about your topics, either for the summer or for the longer term, another really interesting question will be something, again, that Martha brought up, the results of counterterrorism. You mentioned Erica Chenoweth working on this. Well, Gary Lafree and Laura Dugan have already done a study that, there'll be many studies, and the fun for you will be proving why everybody else is wrong, but showing that counterterrorism often does increase terrorism. Harsh counterterrorism measures, I think is how they put it, does in fact increase terrorism over time. There'll be questions, what is happening as a result of the style of policing that we see in New York City and in Los Angeles, where police are really going into the neighborhoods, going into the mosques, collecting information that may in fact be stopping terrorist crimes, it's hard to know, but may also be increasing pro-terrorist sentiment. That's another, I think, important area of inquiry. So I guess looking forward, I think as Al-Qaeda begins to fade in importance, I hope that we won't go back to a period of ignoring the threat. I mean, I think this is in my view, terrorism will remain with us. And I think I urge you to continue with this passion that you've displayed by coming to this course. I think there's a there. I guess the one final thing I wanted to say about nuclear terrorism, we had a major effort to reduce the vulnerability of nuclear materials, and that was a incredibly successful effort. I don't mean that it's totally finished or that it's perfect, but it's astonishing that the international community was actually able to go in and provide material protection, control, and accounting to former Soviet sites. And I think this is something that really had a big impact on the availability of nuclear materials, which was the binding constraint in the view of many experts. So I just wanted, since I was part of that effort, of course I have to say something about it.
Scott, floor is yours.
Now for something completely different, although I think I'll argue it's not entirely different. Last week I was in Rome at a conference of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and there were 45 Catholic laity, women, religious, bishops from around the world engaged in building peace as an expression of their faith. One of the people there, I could tell you 45 different impressive stories, at least they were impressive to me. One was Archbishop John Baptiste Odama, who's the Catholic Archbishop of Gulu in northern Uganda, where, as you know, there has been the terrible onslaught in the past number of years from the Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kony, now infamous through Kony 2012. But Odama was engaged with Kony for a long time before, and he told stories at the meeting that we have heard of Odama going into the bush and confronting Kony, who claims spiritual inspiration and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in his acts of atrocity, and Odama confronting him on his own grounds and challenging him to cease and desist, and the conversations continue. Odama is in his 60s, and he continues to fight for peace and reconciliation in an interreligious coalition in Gulu, which is now trying to stabilize that society after Kony's departure. In Cambodia in the early 1990s, the first free and fair elections were held under the auspices of the United Nations, but they were threatened by the Khmer Rouge that was still in the jungles. And the Supreme Buddhist Patriarch of Cambodia at the time led annual Dhammayatra marches, that is, pilgrimages across Cambodia. And the year that the elections were held, the Khmer Rouge threatened to disrupt them and to kill people who were going to vote in the elections. But this patriarch, Buddhist patriarch Gosananda, led the pilgrimage across these landmine-pocked terrain of Cambodia, and some of the Khmer Rouge joined the procession because of their own Buddhist background. There was a Jewish humanitarian worker as part of the team monitoring Gosananda's pilgrimages, and I talked to her afterwards, and she was distraught because Gosananda had led what turned out to be tens of thousands of Buddhists marching for peace and for free and fair elections. And then when Gosananda was finished, he went back to the mountaintop, so to speak, and all those Buddhists dispersed. And her job was to train them in conflict transformation and reconciliation, and to try to operationalize and institutionalize this charisma. And she was just beside herself because she was struggling with how to do this. She was inspired by her own Jewish faith, trying to work with Buddhists to operationalize the charisma of the Supreme Buddhist Patriarch. A friend of mine, Hizkiah Sasifa, is an African Muslim who spends his career training Islamic leaders in conflict mediation and in nonviolent conflict resolution. He currently is funded by a grant from the Fetzer Institute in Kalamazoo, Michigan, to, along with some other peace builders in different religious traditions, to train followers in Islam in what's described as culturally elicitive peace building, that is, conciliation between warring parties that draws upon the cultural understandings and values and, of course, the languages of the people in the conflict, doesn't impose a kind of getting to yes, top-down model. And Asifa is very effective in this role in seeding Islamic mediators. I could go on and on with these stories about what faith-based organizations, and particularly religious communities and individuals, are doing around the world to build sustainable peace over the long term. These are not people you'll recognize in the headlines because some of their work is invisible to us. A theologian friend of mine says, holiness is invisible, evil is quite visible. And it's true, in a way, that the work of these religious peace builders doesn't get the attention. One of the things we're trying to do, those of us who admire them, is bring attention to them, which in a way is not their point and almost sometimes undermines the kind of work they do under the horizon. But I've called these people militants for peace. That is, I think they're inspired by some of the same dynamics. It's difficult, it's wrong to generalize about people who are in extremist groups that may or may not call themselves religious, because you have bandwagon jumpers in these groups, you have true believers, you have people in between. And so it's difficult to generalize about motivations in any kind of organization devoted to peace or to war. But there are clearly in these various camps people who are committed on religious grounds and believe they are doing the will of God. And these peace builders I'm referring to certainly see their vocation as an expression of their faith and as their way of working out nonviolently some of the solutions to some of the same kind of problems that the people who use the bombs and the guns are also struggling with. These groups are all talking about justice. They're not saying, we're the bad guys and we're just in this to kill people. Even Joseph Kony, who would qualify in that category if anyone does, has his own rationale that he would call a just rationale and even a just peace. Because he calls it that doesn't mean it is. I'm simply making the point that there is this aspiration that is understood through the lens of truth and justice and even compassion. And certainly among those people who have adopted nonviolence as a part of their faith, they are very dedicated, committed, often risking their lives. There's a community here in New York, or a branch of it that some of you know, the community of Sant'Egidio, which is somewhat well known now because of its successful mediation of a number of conflicts around the world, especially in Mozambique in the 1980s and 90s. They're very present there, and they are very deeply formed by Christian values and Christian virtues. And one of the things I found frustrating in researching them is they don't like to call attention to that. They won't say, I'm doing this because I'm a believer or I'm a Christian. They think their actions are sufficient to speak for themselves. So I had to trick Andrea Bartoli one time into continuing to interrogate him. He was on a panel like this, and I kept asking him questions, and he finally got frustrated with me and hit the table and said, I'm a militant for peace. And I said, that's just what I wanted. It's in the book. He believes, and that community, which is gentle, peace-loving, persistent, professional, dedicated, self-sacrificing, vocationally oriented, they're very much inspired by religion. Religious peace building has its own challenges. It is not the answer. It's not the solution. I think in some circumstances it's part of the solution. I told the anecdote about Mahagosananda leaving after the Dhammayatra without training anybody. A lot of these charismatic leaders, not all of them, don't think in bureaucratic terms or technical terms or organizational terms or operational terms, and they often don't have three wings, a financial wing, a diplomatic wing, and a militant wing like Hamas might have, or some of these other organizations we call religious terrorists. They're somewhat clueless, which is also frustrating. They are not thinking operationally all the time. So they work with secular NGOs and with people like Liz Bernstein, who is trained in conflict resolution and organizational management, and they have to be elicited in their own way. That is, they have to learn that it's not enough to preach peace or walk the way of peace. I guess they would say it is. I believe I'm a good old American. How are we going to fix this problem? And they don't always see it that way. So they have to be challenged to move into a kind of operational mode that's really effective. Also, religious actors, including these peace builders who are dedicated to nonviolent social transformation, are not necessarily reliable partners if you're putting on a Western enlightened rational lens. That's both their virtue and the frustration. They're not always calculating things the way you would like to if you want to move from point A to point B in a conflict transformation cycle. They will throw things off kilter. Our challenge for our government is increasingly dealing with religious actors who are public and in power, The Muslim Brotherhood is a case in point. It wasn't that long ago that the suggestion that the U.S. government ought to open more formal channels with the Muslim Brotherhood was scoffed at. Now it's not scoffed at. But there are all kinds of problems with dealing with religious groups that are perceived to be faith-inspired. They tend to be painted with the same brush. We still have kind of a one-dimensional secular lens for this. I found this to be the case. The difficulty of this, my final example, was in interacting a great deal with Tariq Ramadan when we tried to bring him to Notre Dame. This is an Islamic intellectual who is often called Janus-faced, and he speaks one message to his Islamic constituency and another message to the West. He's a charismatic person. He has a wide following, especially among young Muslims around the world. And our media and our way of framing him, and I wouldn't defend everything Tariq does or says, but they expect him to read from a certain kind of script and to read that script to every audience he interacts with. What he sees his goal is trying to mediate between two kinds of discursive communities with overlapping but distinct ways of judging and valuing. And so, yes, he's going to speak in a certain way to a Muslim audience to try to challenge them and draw them and reassure them in the same way to move toward more rapprochement with their non-Muslim brothers and sisters. And he's going to speak to a Western audience in a different mode of discourse than he would speak to that. And that has been very, very difficult for him to pull off. That's part of the challenge of dealing with folks who are trying to appeal in the original religious idiom of the people they're trying to serve, at the same time reach out and make the kind of partnerships that are absolutely necessary for building peace, including building peace through countering the messages of religious violence that are authorized by leaders in their own religious communities. This requires often extreme physical courage on the people who are challenging in places like Mindanao in the Philippines, where I've worked a lot over the last couple of years, and many of our Catholic partners say, why don't more Muslims speak out against the Al-Qaeda affiliate in the Philippines or against the Abu Sayyaf? And our simple answer to them is, if they speak out, they die, or they put their children at risk. And so what you're criticizing for them is not having sufficient courage. That's a different kind of criticism than being two-faced or not wanting peace. So it's a complicated area. There's a lot of interesting things going on, and it's fairly inchoate, but it's worth watching as a future trend in ways that may be surprising.
So I just want to ask you guys, as you think back over the past decade, it was really an opportunity, right, after the 9/11 attacks, for religion to sort of become, and terrorism itself, to move from sort of the marginalized field, whatever, to the mainstream. And so the question is, as you as scholars and also informers to the policy arena think back, what have we learned? And where do we go from here, in a sense? Because is it the case that some of these questions that we've been asking for the past decade will sort of no longer be on the horizon? Students won't be rewarded, for instance, for writing dissertations in this area. Or is it the case that we actually are in a better position to ask better questions? Because you could see it going both ways. On the one hand, because so many people flooded into the field with very little knowledge of religion, all of you accepted, of course, although Martha will say, I study terrorism, I don't study religious terrorism, and Jessica will say, I'm not a religious scholar, I understand individual motivation of perpetrators of these things. But did they sort of bastardize the field that we actually have to do some catch-up work to correct some of the questions that are being asked? So what have we learned anything that we can actually say, we did not know that a decade ago? Jessica, you talked about the data, that the government did fund a lot of data. Well, what sort of findings now do we have that actually we can say with some sort of confidence? I study civil wars and violence. We had the same debates, Martha, about are these old wars? You know, is it old wine in new bottles or new wine in old bottles? We're still having those debates. You know, disorganized mass of thugs or organized, you know, movements with uniforms. But we do have some findings coming out of the Civil War literature and with respect to religion as well. You know, borders are bad. And some people laugh at us saying, really? You know, after 10, 20 years of work, you know, borders are bad, nasty neighborhoods are bad. On the other hand, we do know that with confidence, which means that if you want to control a war, you really do try to, the U.S. government, whomever, try to keep it contained within a given state's borders. So, you know, I pose that to you, and I guess, Mark, I'll start with you, and I guess we'll go in the same order, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Well, I'll speak to the first part of what you said, the question of whether the increased number of people has given greater coherence to the field. And I think actually the situation is the opposite. I remember back in the old days, before 9/11, when a small little haggard group of us, including the people at this table, would get together, Gerald Post, among others, would talk about we need to have centers of terrorist research, that we've got this relatively coherent group, but we learn from each other. And the hope was that after 9/11, when an enormous amount of government money flooded into such studies, that this would be the outcome. That didn't happen. There were indeed some centers, Minerva Project and other supported centers of certain kinds of research. But the proliferation of research was often in fields that were not really compatible with what had been done differently, and went off in its own direction. And it's sort of as if people would take whatever they were doing, slap terrorism on it, and suddenly hope to get a government funding, and without any particular interest in trying to work with other people, or even read other people, or learn from other people. You know, I'm astounded at the number of people who work who now are doing studies in my area, not only have not read my stuff, but any of the other stuff of people I know who work in this area. You think this would be the first thing you would want to do if you're going to leap into it, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So it may be, as in this moment of history where the kind of the incitement of studying terrorism is beginning to fade a bit, what will settle down are people who really are serious about the phenomenon of the use of violence in public life and its intersection with religion and other ideologies to then began to speak in ways that can be understood within a community of like-minded scholars. And perhaps we're at a better point in developing a coherent field of terror studies now in the waning of its enthusiasm than we were 10 years ago.
Well, Mark is quite right that there was an enormous bandwagon effect after 9/11, and it was sort of both good and both bad. It was good that a lot of very distinguished scholars now began to see that terrorism really was something that needed to be studied, that it was an important aspect of national security, foreign policy, even if it was the Bush government's reaction to terrorism more than terrorism itself, perhaps. So in many ways it was counterterrorism, not terrorism, that put terrorism on the agenda. So there was correspondingly a lot more attention to counterterrorism, and particularly American counterterrorism and critiques of American counterterrorism. But sort of looking at where we are now, I think it's probably quite likely that there will be a settling out of the field, that the people who were interested in terrorism because it was so highly topical, and or because they were interested, and or because there was government money for the study of terrorism, some of which was dispensed rather without a whole lot of thought, because this, as we all know, typically this is the way the government goes into things. So we need more of whatever, and they will fund the first 10 people who show up because they're in a big hurry, appear to be in a hurry to sort out what 9/11 was all about. So, but that's only part of it. So if people who were really only transitory in their interest and who weren't genuinely motivated to do deep studies of what other people had written or to do deep empirical work, a lot of what was written on terrorism before 9/11, but increasingly so after 9/11, it's really not based on empirical evidence or study, wasn't based on interviewing people, it wasn't based on collecting data. It was simply, frankly, a lot of it was opinionated, or as Mark said, it was people that took what they already knew about something and just plugged terrorism in where they would have put something else, as though they did a search and replace in their word processing program. And we've all read some of those. So but at the same time, particularly what was, I think, a very good thing is a number of junior scholars who began to move into this as their thesis topics and to do very good work, and actually to go collect their own data in many cases, and to go out and do field work, because we see there really quite a lot. So we've accumulated quite a lot of information. I said to the seminar this morning that I wasn't sure that our theories and concepts had caught up with the amount of data that we have, but maybe that's true the way most fields develop, that there's a burgeoning of interest, there's lots of data, and then you've got to just sit back and reflect and think it through a little more deeply. I myself think that there's still many unresolved questions, and it could be that we'll sort of have a period of relative calm, and so we can sort of ponder these questions without feeling that there's a lot of pressure to come up with some sort of policy recommendation immediately, because if you accept money from the government, you're under that kind of pressure. Well, all right, what should we do? Tell us tomorrow. I was once on a committee of the National Academy of Sciences right after 9/11, and they wanted to know, can we deter terrorists? This is still a great interest of the government. And this was a study that was commissioned by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And apparently their request was, can we deter terrorism? We just want you to tell us yes or no. Don't go this yes or no. Of course, we didn't do that. We wrote a long report about how difficult it was, which is not what they wanted to hear. They wanted an immediate answer. So that pressure may recede to a certain extent. But you know what now everybody's interested in? The buzz topic is cybersecurity and the prospect of cyber terrorism, quote unquote. So that's going to be the new bandwagon effect. I assure you, everybody has moved from terrorism to cybersecurity. There's also quite a lot on nuclear terrorism, as you might imagine, but again, most of that pretty speculative. So if you actually look at the post-9/11 literature and you weeded out what was speculative or not empirically based at all, I mean just purely opinion commentaries, you'd reduce the numbers out there quite a bit. And just returning to something also that Jessica said about the data, well, one of the advantages of the data that we've collected, particularly since 9/11, when there was funding to collect data, was precisely to show that something like 99.9% of terrorist incidents are purely local. And also, I did a study of why the U.S. is targeted, and said, okay, we think we're at the center of the target universe for terrorists, right? It's all against us. Why do they hate us? Most groups out there, fewer than 10%, attack American targets, despite all the rhetoric of, oh, the threat, we're in the crosshairs. Fewer than 10% are interested in attacking the U.S. And of those groups, of which there are about 60, going back to 1970, so over a long period of time, they spend 99% of their time attacking local targets at home. Attacks outside their boundaries are actually quite rare, which is really totally counter, I think, to the public perception of what terrorism is all about. So that's been a contribution of being able to collect this kind of data and to have the time to analyze it.
I think those are really important examples of what can be done when there's more data available. One area that I would say remains of concern to me is the problem of the institutional review boards not approving the collection of data by individual scholars. It's extremely hard to get approved. And just in case some of you don't know what this is about, it's that the scholar has to demonstrate that he or she will not harm the subject, and it does not matter whether the subject has a whole army protecting him and that the scholar is, you know, a 5'3" woman. That's not relevant. And these rules were really developed to protect people from the administration of radioactive milkshakes. You know, we want to make sure that scholars are not going out there harming subjects for no, well, that they're not harming subjects unnecessarily. And so I think this remains an issue that could potentially hamper your research, but hopefully you will get involved in trying to fix the problem.
I'll try to look at the glass as half full and not speak as much about the study of terrorism as my colleagues have, but what have been the unintended consequences, positive ones, of the focus on post 9/11 on religion, violence, and so on. In the academy, I think it's fair to say, and all of these claims are quite modest. I'm trying to look at the glass half full. You could give counter evidence to each one of them. But I think there has been much more attention given to religion as a serious subject of study. Certainly in the foundation world, and I'm not speaking solely or even primarily about religion and terrorism, but religion more generally as an important phenomenon. And critiques being written, one most recently by Beth Hurd, the politics of secularism and international affairs, critiques of the myopia that the country, certainly the government, but the nation more broadly has fallen under for many, many years on the subject of religion. So in fact, the fact that there's calling attention to the need to take religion seriously, and there have been some very good studies produced that might not have been produced or funded prior to 9/11 that don't necessarily address terrorism as such, but take religion a bit seriously. There's also been a lot of second and third rate stuff too, but I'm trying to indicate there's some things that have been produced in some areas of study that might not have emerged quite so well or rapidly. Certainly when I talk about religious peace building and the constructive in religion and civil society studies, religion and international affairs, here at Columbia, there's been a program, Al Steppen's been involved and others, Mark and I and others have been involved in a larger conversation that the Luce Foundation has funded on religion and international affairs and trying to increase religious literacy in our country. You know, these things take a while and they've had mixed results, but I think in general there has been some positive consequences and a deeper understanding of religion, and we had a long way to go, admittedly, as a nation. In terms of the media, it's not quite as rosy a picture in terms of the sophistication of media coverage. There are some people who have taken religion seriously in the media and done a good job, but at least as much of the continuing wasteland of media coverage of religion and the distortions and the like has to do with the industry itself as much as it does with the continuing myopia about religion. Just there aren't people. There were once things called the religion beats on newspapers. There were once things called newspapers. There were people who actually, Peter Steinfels at the Times, you can think of others, who really were quite good and elegant in their media coverage of religion. I think that's declined for the most part, but it's as much to do with publication and the changing in that industry as anything else. One area where 9/11 and all of that has made a difference, I think, has been in the religious communities themselves, to mixed results. But again, when talking just about peace building, there's much more awareness, certainly in the Catholic community than there ever was, and I think more broadly in Christianity. And I believe it could be said, although I wouldn't speak for other traditions, but more awareness and a more sophisticated level of awareness about religious agency in the public square, and about the responsibility of churches and mosques and synagogues and the burdens they face as a result of the last decade and more. So there's a kind of a heightened awareness, and I think to some degree for the good. There are all kinds of problems in the religious communities, and they face scandals, and they faced challenges around their reputation because of the violence associated with religion. But I think there's also an awareness as a result of that on the part of many religious leaders and communities that there's a greater burden of accountability and proof on some of these communities. They haven't always stepped up to that burden. So I think overall there's some signs of progress, so to speak, of a deeper awareness, and at least the questions are being asked. The fact that there are criticisms out there that have to do with religion that are serious, and religion and violence, religion and peace is a step forward from where we were a decade ago.
So there are two mics, or actually there's one mic, so if you have questions, you can get up and address them. Please introduce yourself, although our first questioner shouldn't have to. It's Matthew Connolly, the co-convener of the symposium this year. Matt.
Yeah, so we're about to have well, it started, right, a presidential election. And our two candidates, both of them are going to have to carry some baggage, right, or it's going to be loaded onto them. I mean, we have on the one hand the president who, if you ever Google, Obama Antichrist, it's really quite astonishing, how many people seem to believe that he may be, Satan, or the son of Satan, and then, or at least a Muslim. And then on the other hand, we have Mitt Romney, who has been ridiculed up and down, for his faith. And whose faith I think has to be kind of taken seriously and understood, considering how much a part of his life it's been. So I wonder if any of the panelists would like to comment just on how they see religion playing out as an issue in this election.
I think that's Scott's question.
Well, I'll say one thing. I don't know whether it's by design, political calculation or not, but I believe that this question crossed a threshold with Obama's support of same-sex marriage. Followed by, quick on the heels of the HHS mandate on contraception. These were both in-your-face moves to the conservative Christian community in this country, evangelical and Roman Catholic. Whatever you think about their positions, I'm simply saying the fact of the matter is, there had, evangelical Christians, conservative Christians were in quite a dilemma. Do we choose a Mormon or Obama? And now they're going to choose the Mormon, I think, because whatever purchase Obama might have had on some slice of that community that would never have, or would probably not have voted for him positively, but certainly would not have voted for his opponent, I believe have been pushed into that camp. That might have been by calculation, that he wants to play the politics of divide and conquer. But the timing of those moves in an election year it's very interesting. That he decided to come out with that 1-2 punch. And I believe Romney will do much better as a result, certainly with evangelicals and probably with Catholics as well.
But this I think feeds into our topic, because the heightened rhetoric which comes around elections, even if it's legitimate in terms of a difference in particular policies in terms of church's stance, also fuels extremist perceptions. As you were saying, if you Google Obama and Antichrist, it's just shocking the kind of things that you get. When you begin to Satanize someone, when you begin to perceive them not as political actors with whom you have disagreements, but rather of figures within a cosmic war and a grand scenario in which they become agents of Antichrist, which they are part of a template from the book of Revelation of the end times, and they are playing out these extraordinary roles, then you give license to not just to destroy their character, but destroy them. And the attacks on the president's life already have been frequent. The number of cases, fortunately, have not broadly come into the public. We haven't panicked over it. But there have been a number of already conspiratorial attempts. And I think the likelihood is, if Obama is reelected, that they will increase. Because then you'll have the frustration of this kind of heightened, we have to destroy Satan by voting him out of office, and then he's voted in office. Then what do you do? Then how do you deal with Satan? I think that the possibility of Christian terrorism is a much greater threat at this point of history to the American public than Muslim terrorism or terrorism from many other peoples abroad.
Sorry, I'm even shorter than Jessica Stern, it appears. I'm Tanisha Fazal from Political Science here at Columbia. First, I want to thank you all for a very illuminating panel, and I wanted to ask you a few questions about kind of where the research is at with respect to religious and political violence. Both Jessica Stern and Martha Crenshaw pointed out rightly that most terrorism happens locally and domestically, and oftentimes it happens in the context of civil war. But rebel groups in civil war have kind of a package of strategies that they can choose from. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on why, in some cases, we see them adding to that package or only choosing, because I think a lot of times we talk about terrorism in isolation, but it's really as part of a mix of strategies. So why do we sometimes see the use of terrorism in civil wars but not others? And then the second question I wanted to ask was about how terrorism ends. And to ask whether you think that conflicts in which terrorism is used end differently as compared to conflicts in which it's not used, with respect to war duration, the military outcome. This speaks to some of Monica's work as well, post-conflict justice, any or all of these issues. And then just one final comment to add on to Jessica Stern's completely justified issues with IRB is it's not just the fact that IRBs are an issue for academics. There are also all these laws regarding export controls where it's illegal basically to buy a cup of tea for someone on a certain list if you're interviewing them, and that seems to me to be a real hindrance in conducting research on terrorism and political violence. And this may be part of the explanation for why we have so much more research on counterterrorism as compared to terrorism.
Jessica, you want to start?
Either one. Okay, well, those questions about terrorism and civil war and then how terrorism ends, I know there's new interest in this subject, but yes, we refer sort of blithely to terrorist organizations as though there are organizations out there that do nothing but terrorism, but they're very few and far between. It's pretty rare. There are some. An example from the past would be the Abu Nidal organization among the Palestinian groups, which did very little else. But most of these groups do something else as well, and it might be an affiliation with a political party. It might be providing social services. It could be any number of things, actually, depending on their intentions and their capability in the context within which they're operating. So, when we were beginning the study of terrorism, it did tend to be isolated from the study of civil war. And now I think people, particularly people who study civil war, are now more likely to want to now see that there is terrorism within the context of civil war. And of course, Stathis Kalivas was one of the early ones to write about that, as well as the old versus new civil war issue. Actually, my own work on old versus new terrorism owed a lot to his article on old versus new civil wars. So yes, terrorism is often a part of a civil war. In my early work on Algeria, I mean, the FLN didn't just use terrorism against the French. Obviously, they did a number of different things, but terrorism was very important to their campaign. Whether it was good or bad in terms of the outcome for them is debatable as to whether it really helped them or not, but they used it. And the argument that some people make that a group that aspires to or does control territory cannot, by definition, be said to use terrorism, I think is entirely fallacious. As an argument, because these groups, they do both, and if they're able to control territory, they will. Often groups that use terrorism seek to control territory. So I think that studying terrorism is one thing that they may do, among other things. And it's interesting because back in the early days of our studying counterinsurgency, with all due respect to Kilcullen, we were studying counterinsurgency back during the Vietnam War. And during that period of time, the assumption by the counterinsurgency theorists was that civil conflict began with terrorism, and then when the group got larger and more powerful, it dropped terrorism immediately and moved to guerrilla warfare. We used to call it guerrilla warfare. People remember those days. And then they moved on to conventional warfare, and that was the progress of a conflict. It was very simple. And it took a little while for people to figure out that it didn't go this way at all, that they moved back and forth among these different levels, and that if a group attempted a conventional assault and lost, that didn't mean that the battle was lost or the war was lost for them at all. So I think that's a very worthwhile thing to study, although I don't know the answer to the question of why in some cases they would and why they would not in others. How terrorism ends and whether or not conflicts that have seen a lot of terrorism end differently than others, I don't know the answer to that either, except to say that any conflict in which large numbers of civilians are killed by one form or another, whether we call it terrorism or not, I think are going to be much more intractable and have a much more prolonged conflict ending process. Because remember, when we talk about terrorism, we could talk about just a few selective assassinations of government officials, and that would be terrorism. Or we could talk about large numbers of civilians killed. We could put the Lord's Resistance Army in that. So it really depends on the type of terrorism, I would say.
I guess I would just add that there's one of my favorite pieces on counterterrorism is Audrey Kurth Cronin's work on how terrorism ends that really lays out a number of hypotheses and I think is very useful. Unfortunately, she doesn't directly address the question you're after, I think, which is if terrorism arises in the context of a civil war, does it delay the resolution? And you know, it seems like a good area for research. Sadly, I can't direct you to any work that has addressed that question. I don't know of any. So.
Any other questions? All right. Well, this was a terrific panel. Join me in thanking the panelists. And you know, it's interesting because we talked about sort of the you know, people coming into the field, and I think all of you probably combined, there's probably, 120 years of experience study in terrorism. So I'm sort of commending ourselves by pulling together this panel because, you know, we were thinking about who are the best scholars of religion, terrorism, apocalyptic movements, and peace. It was you. I mean, it wasn't sort of these new. And so I think your work, I mean, Martha, your first book was published, the Terrorism in Context, when was that published? 1994?
My first book was 1978.
And then, but Terrorism in Context was
1995.
1995, and it's still, we read it.
Still in print.
All the time. So, and Scott, you know, I recommend his Ambivalence of the Sacred. It was written in 1999. And I'm sure the research was done in 1997, and it has legs. I use it as a textbook in my class on religion and global politics. So, and then of course Mark and Jessica's book about religion in the name of God and religion in the mind of God, or terror in the religious terrorism in the mind. Either one. In any event, thank you, panelists. Thank you for your scholarship and for your insights.
Thank you, Mom.